Hello, honeys. Welcome back to your weekly Arts World Recap with your host, myself, Celia Bugno. We are very happy to bring you a whole new set of headlines this week from June 28th through July 4th, America's 250th birthday. I was very excited to, for the first time, be in charge of a fireworks show, backyards version, of course. Everybody was safe, the fireworks were awesome, and it was a great time. Quick reminder that part 2 of our Frank Lloyd Wright mini-series, The Formation of a Legend, is streaming now, and that part 3 will be dropping by the end of this week. And now, honeys, your buzz. A few updates on notable stories past to get us started here. The New York City Council and Mayor Mamdani approved a record $323 million in funding for culture. The total, a 7% increase over last year and more than $100 million more than the City Council initially proposed, will go to the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, which administers public funding to arts institutions throughout the city. Mamdani said that the budget was part of his mission to make life more affordable for New York artists in statements about the historic funding amount, while the commissioner of the department, Dia Vij, celebrated the historic budget with statements like, quote, New York believes in the arts and in its artists, end quote. We noticed the headline because of this incredible funding amount, as well as the fact of a newly established $10 million cultural stability fund through this budget that has the goal of supporting struggling cultural organizations through fiscal year 2029. And creation of that fund comes just months after New York's art leaders urged the council to establish exactly this sort of emergency resource for those whose public art grants were in jeopardy under the Trump administration, so local advocates are seeing a huge payoff for all their hard work. Meanwhile, The Telegraph reported that tickets to see the Bayeux Tapestry at the British Museum sold out in just over 24 hours this week in what the museum called the biggest day of ticket sales in its history, despite the fact that tickets to see the 230-foot-long tapestry made in 1070 CE in the UK on loan here are 3 times that of seeing it at home in Normandy, coming in at £33 for peak times and £27 for off-peak times. The publication also informs us that the 2 test runs performed to assess exactly what the embroidery will be exposed to along its journey have both been a success, even though French heritage groups have expressed, as we've covered, lots of concern about possible damage to the delicate tapestry. But if you weren't able to score tickets in the first round, do not fret. There will be 2 more rounds of sales in October and January. We also heard that a series of actions taken since the reemergence of the 300-work Gelman collection in January by both Santander Bank, whose holdings it appeared in, and the Mexican government have led to a coalition of artists, critics, historians, and more calling themselves the Defense of the Gelman Collection to begin legal proceedings against both entities. A recap of those questions. Santander supposedly discovered the collections in its holdings about a year and a half after the Mexican government claimed not to know where it was. This was followed up by a statement which raised further questions from the organization which manages arts initiatives in Mexico, the Instituto Nacional de Bellas Artes y Literatura, in response to questions about the terms of that deal with Santander Bank and other parties involved in the provenance or ownership history of the collection. The Instituto admitted that, quote, public resources would not necessarily be sufficient for an acquisition of this magnitude, end quote. So then how did it end up in the Mexican government's hands? And then Santander Bank traveled the works to Spain for exhibition. According to Mexico's laws guiding cultural heritage, this was in fact illegal and something many in Mexico's art world were not happy about. So why do we care about this Gelman collection? Because of the personal connections between the Mexican people and the works. It contains ones by David Alfaro Siqueiros, Diego Rivera, Rufino Tamayo, and more. 10 Kahlo works are included in that set, while only 7 are owned by Mexico outright, meaning that the Gelman Kahlos add a ton of sheer monetary value to Mexico's existing portfolio. Which leads us to the question of why we care about who owns it or does what with it. Well, there's the obvious question of legality, as representatives for the Defense of the Gelman Collection called Banco Santander and the Institute's actions, quote, unconstitutional, end quote, in their letter to a Mexico City judge. We also see the value of the group's argument that this whole issue shows that, quote, Mexico's artistic heritage should be governed by the Constitution and the law rather than by administrative convenience or private financial interests, end quote. I think they're right to call for the creation of a permanent public viewing space dedicated to the collection, as is common for the holdings of numerous other private collectors who've died. For example, the Frick Collection, Getty Villa, Morgan Library, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the Broad Art Foundation, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney's Museum, Solomon R. Guggenheim's Museum, the Barnes Foundation, the Manil Collection. I could go on. Also in legal trouble last week, the president and the general manager of the Museum of European and Mediterranean Civilizations in Marseille, who were suspended following misconduct allegations and a preliminary investigation opened by the Marseille prosecutor's office into psychological and sexual harassment. Le Monde reports that both President Pierre-Olivier Costa and GM Veronique Hache have been suspended for the same amount of time, 4 months. As of July 2nd, Anne-Marie Leguevel of the General Inspectorate of Cultural Affairs has taken over as interim president. And we're highlighting the story, honeys, because this guy, looking at our sources' summaries of the complaints and open letters against him, the strike threats, or realized ones, and the high turnover rate at the museum since he got there, he's always been kind of a shithead, so that 4-month period seems too short. And we get why Lenore Branch, a representative of the sued union at the museum, told the art newspaper that not only were there, quote, cries of joy in the office, end quote, when the news broke, but also that it's, quote, purely symbolic as there is no way the staff would accept, end quote, the return of either Costa or Hache. And our final follow-up, art fraudster Thomas Doyle, the man who was described by a federal judge as a, quote, career criminal, end quote, the last time we reported on this case, went with a guilty plea on Friday to wire fraud in a scheme involving a Gustave Courbet painting that eventually ended up in the collection of John Landau, Bruce Springsteen's longtime manager. As U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton put it, quote, Thomas Doyle defrauded the owner of a valuable painting by telling a series of brazen lies to get the painting and then sell it so he could keep the profits for himself and quote. Doyle will forfeit the proceeds from the sale as part of that plea and is scheduled to be sentenced in November, but as that description hinted, his long history of existing convictions and art fraud schemes is unlikely to serve in his favor. Moving on to brand new stories of note, a parliamentary report has accused the UK government of a leaderless approach to caring for museums. That Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee unveiled a report titled Financial Resilience of Government-Sponsored Museums and Galleries, which verifies that several of England's public museums are being left vulnerable due to the government's, quote, reactive rather than strategic approach, end quote, and that it's unclear to both the committee as well as the Department of Culture, Media, and Sport whether public money granted to these arts institutions is being valuably spent. According to this new report, over the year 2024 to 25, the DCMS allocated around $640 million in funding to 15 national institutions, but did not monitor its spending in a demonstration of a, quote, lack of leadership, end quote. The art newspaper also reports that the committee accused the government of having taken a, quote, almost hands-off approach, end quote, to the challenges, everything from cybersecurity to the physical preservations of collections, facing its national museums. To be honest, honeys, this is an embarrassing level of disorganization, inefficiency, diligence, and follow-up, basically all the things necessary to make governments and or institutions function. So we hope they get it together real soon. We also got wind from French publication Le Figaro that the renovation work at the historic building, which served as inspiration for Gaston Leroux's 1910 novel and the famous Andrew Lloyd Webber musical adaptation of The Phantom of the Opera, Paris's Palais Garnier Opera, which were scheduled to take only 2 years, quote, is now projected for 5, end quote, with the evaluation for the best method to extract the lead to be undertaken this summer, end quote. That's right, toxic lead levels found in the building have unexpectedly delayed that work, which means that plans to keep one of the Palais Garnier's 2 venues, the historic Epinomis one and the more modern Opera Bastille, open while the other is restored, as well as the project's €670 million or $765.8 million budget, are looking far less feasible. We also learned last week that the ownership of a Van Gogh in the Orsay's collection has come into dispute. 98-year-old Klaus Kallmann, the grandson of Berlin-based company manager Felix Kaufmann and himself a lawyer and art collector, has been in pursuit of the work for 9 years. Kallmann claims that he has childhood memories of the painting titled Hôpital Saint-Paul à Saint-Rémy de Provence from 1889 hanging in his grandfather's villa, and that it was looted by Nazis later, a claim reiterated by his father, Hartmut Kallmann, who always maintained that the family collection was intact when it was taken. But grandson Klaus's effort was thwarted this May when the Commission for the Compensation of Victims of Spoliation, which determines if artworks were Nazi looted, failed to reach a definitive conclusion due to a gap in the work's recorded history between 1932 and February 1934. The painting reappeared that year in the hands of a Parisian gallery dealer, Paul Rosenberg, whose high-profile clients made him a target for specific Nazi looting operations. So, the director of the commission, David Zvi, told Le Monde, while the Kallmann family had, quote, certainly been victims of anti-Semitic persecution and suffered spoliation in this context, end quote, it was, quote, difficult to establish with certainty whether the Van Gogh painting was among the looted property sold under duress, end quote, in part because this is the first time that this situation, a 1933 potentially forced sale, has come up in the French courts specifically. The fact that the commission was established in 1999, and yet this is a first, is kind of amazing and a reason why we care. It goes to show how complex art law cases, especially of this scale, can be. And we couldn't help but notice the family's lawyer, Marcus Stolzel, pointed out that the best practices established in 1998 by the Washington Principles for Handling Nazi-Confiscated Art, signed by 44 nations, states that, quote, consideration should be given to unavoidable gaps or ambiguities in the provenance in light of the passage of time and the circumstances of the Holocaust era, end quote. So, honestly, we're not sure the committee made the right choice here. We also learned that an artist has alleged plagiarism at Manifesta 16 in Germany and requested the removal of an installation. Turkish sculptor Nasan Tur's piece titled Elevation consists of reclaimed church pews installed on their side inside St. Gertrude Church and engraved with anonymous musings submitted by the public, but Bochum-based artist Dorothy Bielefeld told the German outlet WAZ that the forms and concepts of Elevation too closely resemble her 2010 work Aufrichten, or Rising Up, created for a cultural campaign in Germany's Ruhr region. Bielefeld's Aufrichten is participatory too. Visitors could deposit slips of paper bearing their thoughts into pipes embedded in the wall, and another similarity of note, her work was installed earlier in Hamburg's Christkönigkirche, meaning both existed in the Ruhr region. Bielefeld told WAZ that she contacted the event organizers less than an hour after learning of the piece to request its removal from the exhibition, while spokespeople for the event said in statements to the press that while the installations bear, quote, superficial, end quote, visual similarities, the Biennale stands by a curatorial assessment which deemed the work artistically independent, while Tur himself calls the accusation, quote, false and baseless, end quote. We are concerned with this headline because the case seems to hinge on the question of whether two artists can explore the same concepts, in this case, interaction, participation, memory, group experience, in similar formats or sites without infringing on each other's intellectual property. But alas, honeys, I don't have an answer to that one. But if you do, I'd love to hear it, so feel free to send us a DM. Meanwhile, the art newspaper reported that Chile's newly installed far-right government, led by José Antonio Cast, canceled a retrospective dedicated to the late Argentine artist Leon Ferrari at the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Santiago after 3 years of preparation due to lack of funding amid budget cuts to the arts. The why we care here, that same new government was behind the 10% cut to Chile's Ministry of Culture, Arts, and Heritage budget, and as our sources point out, quote, Ferrari's work, which condemns state violence and authoritarianism, is in conflict with Antonio Cast's ultra-conservative politics, which have been connected to the memory of Chile's former dictator, Augusto Pinochet, end quote. So pretty obviously a case where government financial strategies regarding the funding of free speech spaces and the arts successfully resulted in ideological censorship. Sounds familiar. We also got wind from the Moscow Times that the Russian Hermitage Museum, a St. Petersburg institution, has suspended all archaeological expeditions in annexed Crimea as the Kremlin has declared a state of emergency amid a severe fuel shortage and continued Ukrainian attacks. And why are we in the arts concerned with this headline? Well, as Art News puts it, quote, Russia's archaeological activity in Crimea remains a point of contention between Ukraine and the broader archaeological community, as Ukraine does not recognize Russian sovereignty in Crimea and asserts that excavations carried out in Crimea require permits in accordance with Ukrainian law, end quote. So these tensions have resulted in real actions, such as the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence Agency's addition of the head of the Hermitage Archaeology Department, Alexander Butyagin, to the government's War and Sanctions Registry, which tracks individuals accused of violating Ukrainian law in territories occupied by Russia. In 2025 of February, that happened. He was then detained in Poland of that year pursuant to a Ukrainian extradition request, but returned to Russia as part of a U.S.-brokered prisoner exchange. So at its heart, honeys, this is a story of concern for one's national heritage and history, since Ukrainian researchers have argued that these archaeological sites are increasingly being used to reinforce Russia's state-sanctioned narratives about the region's history. And back in North America, a bombshell moment in the case last week as art expert John Zemanovich testified before Ontario's Superior Court of Justice that the late Anishinaabe artist Norval Morrisseau's children helped forge and pass off many of his works as authentic in a prolonged court battle over the alleged scheme to sell 1,400 faked works between 2008 and 2021. The Toronto Star writes that Zemanovich stated that Morrisseau's children were, quote, critical to the success of the fraud, end quote, reportedly adding, quote, I really do not think there's any way possible it could have reached the size it did, end quote, without them. The case, labeled Canada's largest art fraud ever by investigators, already led to last year's conviction of Jeffrey Cohen, one of 8 people arrested in 2023 as a participant. Lawyers for the Morrisseau estate have not yet had a chance to respond to that bombshell testimony, but the estate previously said via its website that it's, quote, very aware of the issues surrounding his art and is working to, quote, bring clarity, justice, and confidence back to his collectors, end quote. And honeys, you may have heard that dozens of ancient artifacts were seized from the Metropolitan Museum of Art last month. Investigators had subpoenaed object records for museum-acquired pieces linked to post-World War II trafficking networks, as well as dealers suspected of falsifying provenance information or omitting it entirely before presenting the Met with the evidence and supporting research to facilitate these objects as restitution. But what's interesting is that the museum has since, kind of paradoxically, framed the June seizures, a grand total of $95 million worth of looted objects, as a collaborative effort wherein the museum shipped them back to the DA's office rather than a categorical refusal of an official demand to do so. Yet our sources point out that the head of the Antiquities Trafficking Unit himself, Matthew Bagdonos, noted in statements that the Bureau has grown frustrated with the slow pace of the Met's provenance review, even with recent expansions of its in-house team dedicated to the effort. He went on to say that the high number of seizures, quote, spoke for themselves, end quote, and that, quote, the question has to be asked, why are we the ones doing this, end quote. These seizures are well documented, honeys. Artforum writes, quote, in 2022, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists reported that the Manhattan District Attorney's Office had obtained 9 warrants to seize ancient artifacts from the Met since 2017. 6 seizures covering more than 30 artifacts took place in 2021 and 22 alone, end quote. In its defense, the head of the Met Provenance team, Lucian Simmons, stated, quote, determining which corresponding present-day country a work came from and the object's unique ownership history is not always straightforward, which is why this work takes time and every individual object deserves to be studied and assessed, end quote. The items seized from the Met this latest round include antiquities from Italy, Turkey, Egypt, as well as smaller-scale items. They range in value from $20,000 to $26 million. More news from another New York institution. The Guggenheim's union has been pushing for increased job protections and higher pay following the abrupt layoff of 20 employees in February of 2025, and 93% of unionized staff gave the green light to strike if necessary last week as contract negotiations enter their 6th month. A spokesperson for the Guggenheim said the museum is, quote, currently at the bargaining table to negotiate in good faith towards a renewal of the contract, end quote, and that the museum and union bargaining teams have reached an agreement on a, quote, number of issues, end quote, in statements to Hyperallergic. We'll let you know if that strike materializes. Meanwhile, the World Monuments Fund unveiled a new list of 10 historic sites across the U.S., including Black Mountain College. The sites whose preservation it deems, quote, essential to the richness and complexity, end quote, of this nation's story range from colonial-era architecture and public health landmarks to early mission churches, all of which, according to the organization, face at least deterioration without some attention. Others are increasingly threatened by rising sea levels. This includes the college, whose storied alumni include post-war painting titan Robert Rauschenberg, color field pioneer Kenneth Noland, and celebrated wire sculptor Ruth Asawa. Its impressive artists in residence list included avant-garde composer John Cage and choreographer Merce Cunningham, who staged one of the earliest happenings there in 1952, while legendary architect Walter Gropius served on the school's advisory board, and Joseph and Annie Albers were the architects of its experimentation curriculum. We're extraordinarily happy to see this incredibly important institution in American art history be recognized. The list also includes the African Meeting House in Boston, the oldest surviving black church building in the U.S. and a former hub of the abolitionist movement, as well as Dallas City Hall, a landmark of American modernism, designed by I.M. Pei, the architect best known for the Louvre Pyramid. Said Benedict de Montlar, president and CEO of the World Monuments Fund, quote, "After decades of work at more than 700 sites in 113 countries, WMF has seen what communities gain when they can protect the places that matter and what is lost when they cannot," end quote. So their support of so many amazing U.S. sites is really worth celebrating. We also heard that the artistic director for the 2028 Guangzhou Biennale will be selected via an open call in a break from tradition. The application process for the 17th edition of the, quote, "closely watched exhibition in South Korea with a broadly international legacy," end quote, will be open June 8th through August 3rd to, quote, "exhibition professionals and curators from around the world, regardless of nationality, gender, or age," end quote. Shortlisted candidates will be interviewed in September, and a final pick will happen in October. And the Why We Care here, as our sources explain, this is a very unusual move for the exhibition, which had previously been organized by decorated curators including Okwai and Wenzor, Nicolas Barriad, Harald Zeman, and Massimiliano Gioni, but this might be a great way to find the next Enwenzor Borja Gioni. A particularly exciting discovery last week, scientists were able to extract from 24 art panels within 11 caves across Spain and Portugal human DNA, and proved for the first time that it can survive for millennia within the paint applied to rock walls. The research is part of a much larger multinational project called First Art, made up of a network of archaeologists, geologists, scientists, and cultural heritage specialists across Mediterranean Europe, China, Germany, and the UK, each working to date and examine the chemical composition of prehistoric rock art. And the Why We Care here, the discovery, of course, of that DNA in the pigment samples they pulled points to the future potential of archaeogenetics in recovering the identities of ancient artists from thousands of years ago, and it could allow these scientists to, quote, go beyond researchers' previous reliance on human bones, sediment, teeth, and faunal remains to reconstruct Paleolithic communities, end quote. Monica Green, a specialist in the history of science and ancient DNA, also called ADNA, explained the importance of this area of study in comments to Hyperallergic this way, quote, "retrieving molecular evidence of the past, whether of humans themselves or the life forms they interacted with, has been revolutionizing our understanding of everything from mass migrations to pandemics," end quote, because, quote, "data can come from anywhere, from the plaque on teeth to the floor of a cave," end quote. This is also a huge win for us art nerds, quote, "new analyses of everything from the linen strands of the Shroud of Turin to the artworks of Leonardo da Vinci also illustrate the latent potential of an ADNA analysis for the field of art history," end quote, says Hyperallergic. And our last couple headlines for today fall into the category of sales auctions and events. The first, a life-size bronze sculpture depicting the suffocation of Trojan priest Laocoon and his sons went for a record £13.6 million or $18.1 million with fees at Sotheby's London on July 1st, marking the highest amount ever achieved by a neoclassical sculpture at auction and blowing far past the work's pre-sale estimate of $2.6 million to $3.9 million. It is known as the Hamilton Laocoon for its previous Duke owner, but it may have hammered for so much because it's one of just 4 full-scale bronze casts of the sculpture created in the lead-up to the early 19th century. And last but absolutely not least, art sales featuring everything from paintings to prints to photographs, artist books, and zines are being sold currently to benefit urgently needed aid efforts in the wake of the devastating earthquakes that hit Venezuela on June 24th, leaving thousands dead or injured, tens of thousands missing, and countless families displaced. including painter Onay Quinones, whose family has issued a call for help in rescuing him. As of the most recent reports, they believe he remains trapped under rubble from his collapsed residential building in the coastal town of Carabayeda. Hyperallergic noted that the, quote, grassroots spirit of these things, end quote, seems to be the common thread through many of the relief efforts right now, quote, defined by direct personal connections or trustworthy intermediary institutions, reflecting both the urgency and the broader skepticism of traditional aid channels, end quote, at this point. The source articles in our episode description have links to some of these relief efforts. Please contribute if you can, honeys. And that is our show for today, July 7th. Hope you've enjoyed. I'm signing off to host my rugby little and her fiancé for dinner. So I will catch you all next week. In the meantime, especially with this heat, hydrate or dihydrate. Take care of yourselves. We'll talk soon. As always, Highbrow Honey would like to thank Chris Meinhold for our music, but this episode of Highbrow Honey was produced, researched, fact-checked, hosted, edited, all that by yours truly, master's degree holder Celia Bugno. If you found today's headlines interesting, send the episode link along to 2 friends.